chapter 2. All right, we're going to begin with verse 12. We're going to look for the next couple of Wednesdays. I'm going to share with you from this chapter as well as some in chapter 1, the First Kings. We're going to pick up this story. This is where Elijah is coming to the end of his life, and he and Elisha now have crossed over the Jordan, and they're standing there, and the chariot comes in verse 12. And it says, and Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof. And he saw him no more. And he took hold of his own clothes, and he just tore them in pieces. He took up also the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and went back and stood by the bank of Jordan. And when the sons of the prophets, which were there to view at Jericho, saw him, they said, the spirit of Elijah doth rest on Elisha. And they came to meet him, and they bowed themselves to the ground before him. Now, as I said, we're going to look at three different things from this story. Tonight we're going to talk about the call on Elijah. We read in God's Word a lot about these two men, great prophets of God. And they just seem to come out of nowhere in the Bible. We see the life of Elijah and how good it was and how God certainly blessed him. And then it comes to a point where it's time for Elisha to go, and God sees something that Elijah did not know. Whenever God takes a person and moves them from a position, he always has someone else waiting in the wings to take over. Now, I said whenever God moves somebody, we have a tendency to move ourselves and call it God. That's some of the greatest mistakes you can make, is to walk away from anything God called you to when God doesn't tell you to do it. Well, I think it would be the best thing for me to do. I think. Anytime that we make a move in our Christianity, we need to certainly hear from God and let God direct us, because he always has someone prepared to take over. In this case, Elijah did not think about it. Maybe he didn't know this was to be his time, but he hadn't thought about it. He had not raised somebody up. Now, I want you to take this story, and I want you to compare it to your life. I say it a lot in here, but I don't know that we understand it. Every one of you need to know that God has a calling on your life. Every one of you. If you're a Christian, he has a calling upon your life. Now, it might be that if I were to ask you tonight, how many of you know what that calling of God is on your life? And I'm not going to ask you. But if I ask you that, I wonder how many would raise your hands and say, yes, I know what it is. And then I would say, well, are you fulfilling the calling upon your life. And there would be some that would say no and some that would say yes. And we say that because we don't know what God wants us to do. We don't know the calling. Anytime that, most of the time whenever I mention a calling upon your life, the devil will distract you and make you think things like, well, he's talking about being a preacher. I've never been called to that. Anybody that tells you that, well, I've never been called to preach, ask them then, what were you called to do? See, we have a defense mechanism that kicks in our lives. And one of the things, well, God never called me to preach. We're very quick to say that. But then ask yourself, then what did he call you to do? And the majority of them, now listen, if the shoe doesn't fit with what I'm saying tonight, don't worry about it. Okay? Everybody knows who I'm talking to. And if I'm not talking to you, don't worry about it. Don't be offended. But we all have a calling, and most people are quick to tell you, well, God never called me to preach. All right, I can agree with that. There are people preaching tonight that have not been called to preach. They shouldn't be in the pulpit. There are some that have been called to preach that are not in the pulpit that should be. So it works both ways. But they'll say, I wasn't called to preach, because that's an outlet for them. Well, I wasn't called to teach Sunday school. Well, then just ask them, okay, what were you called to do? And most of the time, they can't tell you what they were called to do, but they can tell you what they weren't called to do, because they don't want to do that. Does that make sense? Yeah. We don't know what we were called to do, but I know I wasn't called. See, that we throw negatives out there because we're trying to justify something in our lives. But when I talk about having a calling, the calling is not limited to preaching or teaching a Sunday school class or leading a choir or being in a choir. There are multitudes of callings that people have. There are callings, the Bible lists gifts of God. We don't all have the gift of ministry to be here. We don't all have the gift of music. We don't all have these gifts, but we do have gifts. Because everyone that has ever been saved has been called of God to do something. And God therefore has equipped every person with everything they need to be what He's called them to be. So we do have gifts. We have a choice as to whether or not we want to use them. Some of us believe that our gift is to come in church and criticize everything that's going on. I had somebody tell me that one time. That's the honest truth. Honest truth. And I feel sorry for that person. That's not a gift of God. That's a gift of the devil. But we think the gift of ministries, the gift of love, the gift of helps. There is so many things we can do. And I believe that every one of us need to pray earnestly for God to help us find the calling upon our life. And until you know what that calling is, get into the Word and begin to do the works of God until He reveals to you a specific work you're to do. You just can't sit back and wait and say it's okay because I'm asking, He just hasn't told me yet. As soon as He tells me, I'll know and then I'll do it. Well, you're a bench warmer. And there's no place for bench warmers in the kingdom of God. He doesn't need people to warm a bench. He needs people to get up. So we look at this story now, and we see that in this Elijah is going to be taken up to God. He's here one moment, he disappears. And the Bible says that Elisha watched it, and that he was just taken up in the wind, just gone, but his mantle fell back to the ground. Have you ever wondered why? How could everything that Elijah have go with him, but not the mantle? Why did it fall back to the ground? Well, we're going to look at that and try to understand something different about it. I want to go back over to 1 Kings now. And there we're going to read the story of when Elisha was called. Now, Elijah is already in the ministry. He's already done many great things. He's getting on up there in time. And God is watching, and God says, you know, Elijah needs someone to take his place. So the Lord looks down, he sees one called Elisha. And he begins to speak in the 19th chapter of 1 Kings. And God is giving directions to Elijah. In verse 16 he says, "And Jehu shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha thou shalt anoint to be a prophet in your room." He's saying, I want you now to anoint Elisha to be a prophet just like you are. Now, these were the words of instruction that were given to him. And then verse 18 it says, "Yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, and all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him." So he says to Elijah, I now am giving you someone that is going to be a prophet with you. He will be a prophet in title, just like you are. But he is not ready to be a prophet as you are. He must learn, as we would say today, he must learn the tricks of the trade. He's not ready to do what you're doing. But I'm going to take him, place him with you. Let's back up. He said, I'm going to take him, give him an opportunity to be placed with you and to learn from you so that one day he can become a prophet of your caliber after you go away. Now watch the language. I'm going to give Elisha the opportunity to come with you, to train under you, so that he can become a prophet one day like you are. So these are the words that God is giving out. And I want to read this to you now in a different translation, and I want you to just listen for a moment at what it says. I want you to anoint Jehu as Israel's next king, and Elisha to replace you as a prophet. So you're going to anoint him to replace you at some point as a prophet. Then it says, Elijah journeyed to find Elisha. So he tells Elijah, I want you to anoint Elisha. So now you got to find Elisha. So he's traveling towards Damascus. And Elijah journeyed to find Elisha. And he found Elisha in the field where 12 pairs of oxen were being worked. Elisha was with the last pair. Elijah wrapped his cloak, his token of spiritual power, around Elisha. And Elisha abandoned his oxen and chased after Elijah. So as Elijah is walking along, he sees this field. And the field is so big that there are 12 teams of oxen, 12 people plowing. It'd just be like we have tractors today. And you've seen fields where they got a tractor going and one behind him, and they're plowing this field. So they're out there plowing. And Elijah knows that this is Elisha. He knows this is the one that God has already promised him. He knows that he has to anoint him. So the Bible says he just walks up. In other words, he walks out in that field somehow, comes up to Elisha. He takes his cloak or his mantle off. and wraps it around Elisha. So this is new to Elisha. He's a farmer. He says, now, it said that Elisha immediately abandons his oxen and goes after Elijah, because as soon as he wraps it around him, he doesn't really say anything. He just leaves. And Elisha chases him down. And I said to you, God promised Elijah that he could anoint Elisha and that Elisha would have the opportunity to follow Elijah and be trained to become a prophet just like Elijah. So here is that meeting. They meet. Elijah doesn't say, I prayed for you and God told me you're going to be the next prophet. He didn't say any of that. He just takes his coat off, a mantle, wraps it around him. And now the scene changes. And it says that Elisha drops what he's doing, his moment and time in history. He dropped what he was doing and ran. But he ran towards his calling. He's not sure everything's happening, but it doesn't. And it says, Elisha says, before I leave, allow me to tell my parents goodbye, and then I will journey with you. Now, you know that Jesus, when he was traveling, he talked about the reasons that people don't follow him. First, I bought a piece of land, let me go check that land out. As soon as I check that out, I'll come and be one of your followers. Or I got to go bury my mom and dad. As soon as I get through that, I'll come and I'll be one of your followers. This is not the same thing going on here. Elisha has to choose to follow Elijah. He has to. God has anointed him, as I'm telling you that every one of us have been anointed and called before we were born to be God's people with certain walks in life for every one of us. But we are going to have to choose whether or not we're going to follow God. We have to decide what's most important. And Elisha, working for the family, when his moment arrives and he places that cloak on him, he drops what he's doing, runs to Elijah, and says to him, listen, let me go tell Mother and Daddy goodbye. And as soon as I tell them goodbye, I'm going with you. He's not putting it off. This is a different thing, and you'll see in just a moment. And Elijah looks at him, and Elijah says, well, go then and tell them goodbye. What have I done to you? In our language, he said, well, go and tell them bye, because I'm not putting any pressure on you. So go do what you want to do. So he turns around and goes back. Elisha realizes that Elijah is questioning his devotion. See? He realizes that. Will he stay with the parents or become a prophet? And Elisha demonstrates his devotion to God by destroying his livelihood. So Elisha goes back. Now he knows that cloak symbolizes something that he's not accustomed to. It's a piece of cloth to me and you. But to Elisha at that moment, something has transpired within his spirit that has something to do with that cloak. And he immediately chases after the person who owned it and says to him, wait, and I want to go with you, but I got to tell Mom and Daddy goodbye. Now the moment in his life is he's wavering between two things. I want to go after this which is strange to me and odd, but there is a drawing to me to do this, but I got to go tell Mother and Daddy goodbye. That is so hard for me and you to do in life. We have to make choices. We have to take care of the family. Well, God expects me to work. God expects me to provide for my family. God expects me to do this. I got to take the babies first. We use all these excuses for avoiding what God has called us to do. And I'm saying this to tell you that I know for a fact that every one of you in here are called to do something. And those calls, many of them are unfulfilled because you have just thrown your arms up and you just don't know what to do. or that calling upon your life is is so strong in such a way that's going to cost you something. Well, I'll tell you this, that every call that God has ever placed on any human being that's ever been alive, every call costs you something. But what you receive from that call far outweighs what it cost you. So as Elisha now turns back, he's caught in the middle. Here is what I just have this drawings for some reason. I have this drawing, but I got to go back and tell Mother and Daddy. And here's a real problem that he has, because Elijah knows that the moment he turns and goes back here, that the devil begins working on him. You got a good farm here. Mom and Daddy need your help. There's no sense you doing this. You don't even know who this man is. You don't even know what you're called to do. You know, all this goes on in his mind. And Elisha, as he's walking back now, he's turned his back here. He's walking back towards his parents. And the Spirit of God begins to really work with him. And he says, you know, this is a test. I know that Elijah is wanting me to make a decision. And I know that he knows I'm wavering between the two. And I've got to do something to show him I'm serious. I got to do something to show God, because he's talking about God, but he's talking about Elijah. He's putting those two together. So he turns back, goes back there, and he does not go to his mom and daddy. He goes back out in the field where his oxen are, and he kills those two oxen, then breaks up the plows that he has. Everything that he was using behind them, he breaks it up, builds a fire, and cooks that meat. Then he takes that meat and serves it to all those people that are out there watching what he's doing. And perhaps he calls the parents and other people, and they all come out and they have this feast. It was at that moment that Elisha broke those things, killed the calf, that he said in his spirit, I want God more than I want anything else in my life. God is before my job. God is before my desires. God is before the people around me and what they would have me to do. God is before my parents. I destroy everything in my past that has anything to do with my past that would draw me back to where I once was. I'm going to turn and walk towards God. And I'm never going to look back and be drawn by these things. I don't know how many of you have ever faced that before. I have. Choices you have to make with God. Sometimes we make them and they're right, and sometimes we don't make them. But God's call never goes away from a person. And if God called you before you were born, until the day you die, that calling's still there. You can reject it, you can refuse it, you can choose to not find it, and that will not be an excuse. Well, that will be an excuse. It won't be a reason when you face God. But the calling's there. Everything you need is there. But there are many of us that have started out good, and we want to serve God, and we want to follow God, and we turn. And let me just get this straight, and we turn and go back, and the devil says, no, you can't do that, because think of this, and think of this, and think of this, and think of this. And if you sit there and think long enough, you'll change your mind. He walked right back out that field and destroyed everything he had. Everything he had. And when he destroyed it all, that was his commitment. There's no turning back now. I remember when I came into the ministry, I worked for 2 years here and still worked in the carpet. I just had 2 jobs. But I remember the day that God told me it was time to get out. And I got out. But there came another day whenever God told me, now get rid of all your tools. And I called Mikey's daddy, Ron, and I said, Ron, I want you to come over here. I gave him my stuff. See, we got to say, well, I'll try. If it doesn't work, I'll go back. Yeah, I'll try. And I've always got this. Yeah. God said, I want you to sell it all out. Get rid of it. Sell out to the past. And I did. Every one of us have had to face the same situation. God or the world. And Elisha said, for me, it's God. And he burned that stuff to begin with. Wouldn't it have been simple for him to go up and get some firewood somewhere and start a fire and save the equipment for someone who's going to take his place? It would have been smarter to go get a calf or a cow or a lamb or something that was in a field. Why trained animals that somebody else could have used? No, whenever God gets involved, you just listen to the Spirit, and you'll be surprised what you'll do. What man thinks is foolish is great wisdom to God. So here Elisha, he gets his call. He answers the call, but we'll pick up next week, but what made the difference in his life? What was that mantle? What was that mantle? He wrapped it around his shoulders and walks off, and it's so powerful that Elisha runs, turns his back on everything and follows God. What's so special about it that whenever Elijah went up, it fell back down? See, that's a key part of all this story, is what that thing is. It got him from the beginning, and it kept him to the end. Do we have mantles? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And when you understand what it is, you'll know. Yes, we do. And many of us have failed to pick up the mantle. That's why our life is so messed up. We're avoiding God's call. We're trying to work it out ourselves. It was crazy me and my knowledge that got me in trouble. And then I say, well, crazy me and my knowledge will get me out. Isn't that dumb? That's how we think, though. I can handle it. I got myself into this, I'll get myself out. Really? All right, we're going to pick up here, and we'll talk next week and go past there with it. Elisha and Elijah. Read up on it in your Bibles. That's what we're going to be talking about for 2 or 3 weeks, and let you be a good part of it, okay? Father, we thank you for the word. Every one of us have been called. We all have different callings. God, it's up to us to fulfill that calling. If we avoid the call, it's going to be counted as sin. For he that knoweth to do right and doeth it not, to him it is a sin. We know we're supposed to find that calling. So, Lord, I pray that you help everybody in this building, myself included, to begin to pray, God, what would you have me to do? My calling, Lord, may be to be a minister, but there's other callings. There are other things. I got to find them too. I can't limit it to one thing unless you do. So show us all what you'd have us to do. And Lord, I sure thank you for it. I sure do love you. And it's in your name we pray tonight.